once again by Roger Pulley. He's a reader in the Loggerheads group of churches, and David Primrose, Director of Transforming Communities for the Diocese. Thank you for coming, gentlemen. And this week we're discussing chapter 3 of the book, What We Have, We Hold. This is a chapter that really resonated with me. He begins just by that challenge, doesn't he, of thinking about something that's very precious to you, something that's very valuable, not necessarily expensive, although it might be very valuable, and asks us to consider what would be the situation in which we might give that away. And I wonder, when you thought about doing that, what sort of feelings or thoughts did that provoke in you, and you imagine giving away something very precious to you?
For myself, it's a bit strange because I'm somebody who's reasonably detached from stuff.
Okay.
So it was quite difficult for me to think of stuff to give away, and I guess I don't engage with that in the way many other people do. But when I thought about things that do matter to me, like relationships, and I thought if some of them were going to change or be different, or indeed just next week my son gets married and married my daughter, and that giving away of a relationship and really entrusting somebody who once cared for to somebody else, very difficult.
Very difficult. Absolutely. How about for you, Roger?
I suppose I retired not long ago, and I'm a retired academic, so I have an awful lot of books. And I just in order to maintain marital harmony, I had to get rid of some of them.
Gosh.
But instead of selling them to begin with, I took advantage of a friend of mine who was our best man and was Professor of German at Oxford. And what he did was he opened his doors on his last day and invited all his postgraduate students in and said, take what you need.
Lovely.
And that way, and so I...
And did that make it a bit easier, knowing that they would go to people who would use them? And
well, that's right. And I mean, there's a certain amount of satisfaction in people's gratitude, and you have to be a bit wary of that. But at the same time, it felt as though I was handing something on rather than, just
going to waste in some way.
Yeah,
I have to say, when I thought about that, and I couldn't quite pin down what I thought my most valuable thing was, but I definitely felt suddenly, like I am the kind of one in the Lord that we say, my precious, don't take that away. And I was quite surprised how possessive it did make me feel, that sense of someone taking something that's mine. And he talks a lot in this chapter about that sort of possessiveness, perhaps coming from an economy of scarcity. Can we unpack that a little bit? What does that economy of scarcity look like, and what does it do to us?
Love to unpack that, because I see it profoundly in our society, a theology of scarcity that says when God made the world, he didn't quite give us enough.
Yeah.
So we have to look after what we've got, otherwise those other people on the other side of the Channel or the other side of the Mediterranean or even the other side of the village might get what is ours. And if we had to share, there wouldn't be enough to go around.
Yeah.
And there's something blasphemous about that theology. And the church that says generous God, practicing generosity, theology of abundance, the fact that we can be extravagant belongs to a theology of abundance. And holding on to what we have belongs to a theology of scarcity, and that creeps into the church as well as into every other part of our society.
Oh, it certainly does. What ways does that sort of theology of scarcity play itself out in sort of practical examples? How do we see that, perhaps in our own lives or perhaps in society more generally?
People very quickly might be thinking, well, if they're going to use the church, we must charge them for the heating.
Right.
And the amount that comes in from the heating is a very small amount of money. But the attitude that says we must protect and maximise the little we have, otherwise we could go out of business.
There's a great line, isn't there, somewhere, I think it's in this chapter, where he's talking about a church warden. The vicar is saying, I want to, give some of this, and the church warden say, what do you think we are, a charity? And the vicar sort of was saying, oh, maybe it was even when Justin Welby was a vicar, I think he used that example of, actually church wanting to grasp onto stuff rather than be free and generous with it. So he uses the example in this book in this chapter of Mary pouring out that sort of lavishly extravagant perfume on Jesus, and contrasts that a bit with the attitude of Judas in that. How does that story illustrate some of the things that are going on here, Roger?
Well, it is extraordinarily extravagant.
Yeah.
And I suspect quite a lot of us would, in the presence of that, say, well, that's a bit of a waste, isn't it? Although equally, I suppose, one might be moved by it. And one of the things about extravagance and generosity is not just that you stand and admire it from a distance, but that it starts to make you question your own, or my own, rather sort of tight-fisted approach to stuff.
It is quite easy to empathise, I think, with Judas in this part of the story, to look at that extravagant, lavish gesture and just think, well, that could have been used to help the poor. How does Judas' attitude there illustrate something of what we were just talking about, the theology of scarcity?
A lot of my work's to do with situations where people are living in adversity, low-income neighbourhoods, people who are struggling, and that's the place where opportunities for worship, for generosity, for making oneself available to others are most precious, because people recognise that we do not want life reduced to how much money there is. We want to see something much greater, much grander, something that's relational between people, something that's relational with God, and that sense of worship as being the most extravagant thing we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's very clear on that, isn't it? That actually what Mary's doing is not just throwing perfume around in a reckless, wasteful way. What she is doing is worship, and that transforms her gesture. So what might that mean as we're thinking about what we do with our own possessions or money or resources or whatever? What sort of priorities is that suggesting we should have?
It's a tricky one, because in some ways you can say the church is very good at being extravagant with building buildings.
Right, exactly.
To do worship
We've got
in.
Lichfield Cathedral just across from where we're sitting, and by any standards it's a lavish building.
But it's also a way of recognising that God is God.
Yeah.
And I know some friends who run an occasional healing service, and they regard worship as an essential preliminary, that even though you're asking God for something really quite specific, and something you might think from Jesus' own ministry that he'd be quite happy to give, it's the context of worship, they say, that really opens it up. So it's not just a question of saying worship really is the giving of all of you, whatever you happen to have, whatever you happen to be, but it's also a releasing of the relationship of God and us, which results in another sort of abundance, which isn't necessarily material, but it can change people's lives, not just their feelings at that moment.
Right, and that's part of what we've been talking about in previous chapters. We tend to measure and see what we value, and money is a very easy thing to measure, and so we think, well, that's what's important. But actually, part of what's going on here is transforming our attitudes, seeing, well, what is God's generosity towards us? And that, that's part of what you were saying, David, about in areas where there's deprivation and poverty and so on. What transforms lives isn't just application of more money. Lives are whole lives that need to be transformed in all those sorts of ways. He talks, doesn't he, about these attitudes of actions of extravagant generosity as being one way that we can think about dethroning mammon in our lives. What sort of ways do you think perhaps we could be encouraging people to think more in terms of extravagant generosity?
There's something about whose is the world anyway, just to begin with, by actually saying it's God's world, God's creation, of which we have, with great humility, the opportunity for a little bit of stewardship, for a little bit of time, and we pass it on to others that they might enjoy the same world. And the moment we say we only have it on trust, that begins to change.
Absolutely. So that's my challenge for you this week, is to think about finding an opportunity to show some kind of extravagant generosity to somebody else. It might be a financial gift, it might be an act of service, it might be spending time lavishly with somebody else who needs it. But see if you can think about the resources that God's given you as enough and more than enough to share.